Good morning, everyone, and good evening to our audience joining from Korea. I'm Yeonho Kim, Associate Director at GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIX. Thank you for joining our webinar on a new frontier of cooperation, the fight against COVID-19, co-hosted by Jeju Peace Institute, or JPI. Today's webinar is the second of the series co-hosted by JPI. Last week, we discussed various aspects of reopening. And today, we are discussing the cooperation between the US and Korea in the fight against the coronavirus. The two allies, as you know, have been sharing information on containing the coronavirus and cooperating on procuring COVID test kits. And Korea, the recipient of the US aid during the Korean War, also donated a protective mask to the US in honor of the 70th anniversary of the Korean War. Moving forward to the next stages of reopening, I think Seoul and Washington could continue exploring the new frontier of cooperation in the public health sector. And today I'm very excited to have an opportunity to hear from distinguished Korean and American journalists on this very important topic. They're all joining us from Seoul, so I'd like to thank the panelists and JPI team for staying up late at night for us. Let me briefly introduce today's speakers first. So our first speaker is Hyunju Park, a staff reporter at JTBC. She has been covering foreign affairs, including the first and second US-North Korea summits, reporting live from Singapore and Hanoi. And currently, she is with the Global News Division at JTBC. And our next speaker is Latisha Go, a staff reporter at the Korea Herald. Latisha has covered many social affairs in Korea, including Korea's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. She was also a correspondent at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, covering the nuclear diplomacy involving the two Koreas and the US. We also have two journalists from American media outlets as discussants today. Sang-Hoon Choi is Seoul Bureau Chief of the New York Times. Before joining the Times, he worked for the Associated Press and has won journalism awards for his reports in Korea and Myanmar, including a 2000 Pulitzer Prize. Last but not least, Anthony Kuhn is Seoul correspondent for NPR. He previously served as NPR correspondent in Beijing, Jakarta, and London. Prior to joining NPR, he wrote for the Far Eastern Economic Review. And here's how we will structure today's discussion. After Hyunju and Latisha make presentations, the panelists will have two rounds of discussions, followed by a Q&A open to the public, the audience. So we will take questions from now so that you won't have to wait until we open it up to Q&A. When you type in your questions in the Q&A box on the right panel of the screen, I guess, please make sure to identify your name and affiliation. With that, let me turn it over to Hyunju. Hyunju?
Yes. I'm deeply honored to share knowledge and insights with a group of such talented panelists and journalists. And I'm Hyunju Park, reporter from JTBC broadcasting station in South Korea. And I'm now in international affairs team. And I'm not so fluent in English, and I usually write my stories in Korean. So my expressions might sound not so natural sometimes, but I will do my best to contribute to today's session. Then let me begin my presentation. I will start screen sharing. I will start my presentation with pictures taken last April at the Incheon International Airport, South Korea. You can see many boxes waiting to be loaded for delivery. Can you guess what these boxes are full of?
Test kits?
Test kits? Oh, you were correct, yes. They were full of coronavirus test kits made in South Korea, and they were going to the US. These are enough test kits to run as many as 600,000 coronavirus tests. President Trump asked for help during the phone call with President Moon to secure the medical equipment, and we immediately took action to provide assistance. After the shipment, U.S. Ambassador to South Korea, Harry Harris, tweeted that the U.S.-RK alliance is ironclad and we are in this crisis together. And then I have two other pictures here, which were also taken at the Incheon International Airport last month. South Korea sent 2 million face masks for emergency assistance to the US. And this time also, Ambassador Harris said, our alliance and friendship are as vital and ironclad today as it was 70 years ago. By 70 years ago, he meant Korean War. The South Korean government also sent 500,000 masks to Korean War veterans living in the US. So these are all signs of trust and respect between the two allies, which have stayed strong for 70 years, even at a time of war and unexpected crisis like COVID-19. And I think this is a challenge that we have to overcome together as longtime allies. And other than providing face masks and test kits, US and South Korea shared with each other various knowledge and experiences and know-how in tackling the crisis. For example, South Korea held parliamentary election last April amid the pandemic and successfully carried out the whole process. The voter turnout was 66.2%, which was the highest since 1992. And as the US is preparing for a national presidential election in November, the two governments recently held video conference to share the know-how about a series of election day antivirus prevention measures. And also, US and South Korea did not impose travel ban to each other's citizens. The two countries left the doors open for each other's citizens, which means that they didn't stop their citizens from visiting each other's countries. And in a diplomatic aspect, as the travel restrictions work in a reciprocal way, it's a good thing that the two countries maintained people-to-people exchanges and kept trust with each other. And then I will move on to the current situation of South Korea, and I'll briefly mention the current situation of South Korea. And you can see the graph of the daily count of newly confirmed cases in South Korea. The number of new infections 909 in late February, but as you can see, we have seen a dramatic slowdown in the number of new cases. We have flattened the curve through widespread testing and thorough contact tracing and nationwide efforts to contain the disease. And this is an article written by Sang-Hoon Choi from New York Times, who is with us today. And this article shows how South Korea flattened the curve. And so what has South Korea done differently? Until last month, I was one of the press pool of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Korea. One of the senior officials there summarized the government's policies as 3T method, which means test, trace, and treat. As he said, the key measures taken by South Korean government can basically summarized as those 3 T's. The first T is about testing capability. We have the capacity to test up to 20,000 people a day. We are running drive-through testing station, as you can see on the photo. And the testing takes only 10 minutes, and the results will be texted to you within several hours. And it's really convenient, and since you don't have to leave the car, you don't have to get out of your car, so you have lower risks of infection. And we also have walk-through testing station, and here you can also finish the test only in 10 minutes. The whole process goes from filling out the medical questionnaire to swabbing, and it's done. The whole process is done very quickly. And the second T is about tracing. We use a wide network of surveillance cameras and credit card records to trace the patient's contacts. We also provide details about the situation and information about the places where the infected people visited through websites, mobile apps, and text alerts. And this is the text messages I actually got early this month, and this is the mobile application I used to get an information about the COVID-19 in South Korea. And of course, there have been privacy concerns. It was effective in terms of public health, but there have a lot of people have said that we should not disclose too many detailed information about confirmed cases. And I want to leave this part for our discussion. And also about monitoring confirmed patients, we also use wristbands to stop people breaking the quarantine rules. And it has been also very controversial in South Korea to make people wear wristbands, even if they are not criminals. They are only the infected people, but do they have to wear the wristband? It was a matter of controversy here. And wristband trackers are connected to the apps via Bluetooth. And if a person leaves home without permission, it will alert government officials. Nearly 50 people have been ordered to wear the wristbands here. And people who have violated the rules have a choice between wearing the bands or go to the government-sponsored facilities. They can either wear the bands or just go to the government-sponsored facilities once they break the quarantine rules. And South Korea actually exported this product to Saudi Arabia. South Korea recently exported 100,000 wristbands to Saudi Arabia. And the last T is about treatment. The South Korean government provides appropriate treatment in hospitals for the confirmed patients and sometimes use cohort isolation to disinfect the medical facilities. But without vaccines, we cannot guarantee that the patients are treated effectively and properly. And even without vaccines, some say that the strongest vaccine is people's will to behave with responsibility to overcome the crisis. And so far, South Koreans have strictly followed guidelines for social distancing and washing their hands often and wearing masks every time they go out. So some people say that it has been the strongest vaccine. So now we are trying to share our know-how for disease control with other countries, and it's called KQuarantine. We have actually branded it. The South Korean government is working to create a KQuarantine export package that includes a public health surveillance system, self-quarantine app, and mask tracking app. And Colombia and South Africa and many other countries are really interested in actually importing this quarantine package, and the government officials said that this package will come in several languages, including Spanish, English, and Arabic. So we have seen a recent rebounding cases which were related to nightclubs in Seoul, karaoke rooms, and an e-commerce warehouse. The number of new infections dropped to less than 20 early last month, but suddenly spiked up, and we are still seeing double-digit increases every day. And as President Moon said, it's not over until it's over. The fear of second wave would always be there, and we should not be complacent. And so, as in all the other major issues, I hope that US and South Korea can be an important partner in coping with COVID-19, and to respond faster than the speed of disease spreading, I think we should go shoulder to shoulder. And I sincerely hope that the situation will be overcome as soon as possible. And I hope that this could be a chance that we can learn that we can overcome any kind of unprecedented crisis together. And I will wrap up my presentation here, and thank you for listening. And these are my discussion questions, and most of the questions are about the cooperation between the two countries. And I would also like to talk about the role of journalists in tackling this kind of global health crisis. And I will show you this screen again in the discussion session if needed. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Hyunju, for the comprehensive picture of the status of the cooperation between the two countries. Now we have Latisha Go. My understanding is Latisha has a kind of a different approach coming from kind of a societal perspective. So Latisha?
Yes, hello. This is Latisha Go from the Korea Herald. It's my honor to be participating in this meaningful webinar where we can explore how South Korea has handled the pandemic and what lessons it can offer to other countries, including our very important ally, the US. So let me just share my presentation and we can go on with the As our previous presenter, Park Hyun-ju, successfully pointed out, the Korean government's 3T strategy, testing, tracing, and tracing, played a major role in bringing the coronavirus situation under control. That I think was only a part of the whole picture. Aside from the government's coordinated handling of the pandemic, based on extensive tracing and contact tracing, testing, there was something else that helped Korea successfully flatten the curve without closing its border or imposing lockdowns. And that was Koreans' voluntary and active participation in the fight against the virus, which was made possible thanks to Koreans' trust in the government, as well as Koreans' Nunchi culture, putting some pressure on each other to follow rules and not to cause harm to collective interests. So here's my presentation. Today, I'd like to quickly talk about the COVID-19 situation in Korea and key developments until now, and then I will move on to how Koreans have helped the government slow the spread of the virus from social and cultural perspective. So let's look at the numbers. As of Thursday, Korea has a total of 12,563 coronavirus cases. Some 11,000 confirmed cases have been released from quarantine, bringing the portion of recovered patients to 87.3% of all confirmed cases. We are testing about 20,000 people every day, and so far, as you can see, we have tested some 1.2 million people. If you look at the chart, this one, the blue line is the number of new infections, and the gray line is the number of patients released from quarantine. We confirmed the first COVID-19 case on January 20th, and we started to see a spike in cases in late January, and the daily number of cases reached a peak of 909 on February 29th. The government began 2 weeks of social distancing campaign, which was extended by May 6th. And on April 19, new cases fell to single digits as the infection rate continued to slow the government transition to everyday quarantine system. I thought it might be interesting to Americans because you don't have this everyday quarantine system. It is a concept to allow citizens to return to their normal daily routines while still following quarantine rules such as wearing a mask and just keeping a physical distance from others. It seems like a second wave of infections is underway after relaxing social distancing campaign, though the scale seems a lot smaller. The number of new cases still remain in the double-digit range. And behind the success in curbing the spread of the virus is that Koreans followed the government's guidance relatively well. From the early stage of the COVID-19 outbreak, Koreans largely did not mind giving up their personal information for the sake of the government's extensive contact tracing. They wear masks and tried to avoid doing things against the government's advice. Many stayed home, stayed away from gathering in large numbers or going to closed indoor places. But how was that possible? I mean, why Koreans in general follow the government's guidance without questions? I think one of the answers could be the high level of Koreans' trust in the government and its legitimacy. Let me briefly introduce how the government has briefed the public, informed the public through media and other measures. So there were 2 briefings every day by the central government, one by the disaster countermeasure headquarters consisting of officials from the Health Ministry and Welfare Ministry and Education Ministry. And the second briefing was by health experts from the Disease Prevention and Control Headquarters. And they were all live streamed. While the country's weeks-long social distancing campaign was in place, reporters could not physically attend the briefings. So their questions were taken via social media messenger group chat real time. The health authorities' daily report would be updated on its website in the afternoon with details like the number of new cases, deaths by region, age, sex, nationality, and how they got infected. On top of that, each municipal government briefed the public separately. the number of cases in the city and the region, rough movement of those people who were recently diagnosed in the regions, and then so that they could help the public who might have come into contact with confirmed cases could voluntarily go to testing stations and seek the COVID-19 testing. And there were emergency text alerts informing the public of safety advice. Many Koreans were like, they complained that it was almost too much information. And then in the early stage of the pandemic, it seemed like central government and municipalities were almost competing to release more information to the public, which to some extent added to some public fears about the coronavirus. So the government's such active sharing of information helped ease public concerns and gain trust from Korean people. This is the survey by Dongdae Research Institute conducted in late April on the government response. Asked why what they rely on most in responding to new outbreak of new infectious diseases. 69.3% said they rely on the government capacity, and 62% of people said mature civic awareness. Basically, yeah, they rely on each other's citizens' awareness. And there is another important factor which I find quite interesting, the Koreans' unique sense of unity and solidarity. Like volunteers rushed to the Jeju, which was at the center of the virus outbreak, to help the city bring the situation under control, and landlords voluntarily reduced rental fees for tenants and small businesses hit hard by the coronavirus outbreak. At a time like this, Koreans are proud of coming together and taking care of each other, sharing a burden to overcome the national crisis. On the examples, one of the examples of that a quarter of the country's population during the Asian financial crisis voluntarily participated in the gold collection campaign and sold their cherished gold items to help save the economy from bankruptcy. Such a powerful shared memory of just lives on. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, many Koreans consoled each other, saying, yeah, it is our hobby to overcome a national crisis. 국난 극복, that's what we said in Korean. So, yeah, and there is also Nunchi Culture. It's a very tricky one. It is a concept linked to the collective culture in Korean society. It is a concept signifying the subtle ability to read others' mind and mood. It may be similar to emotional intelligence, but this appears to build up some social pressure, like peer pressure, as we're expected to be more conscious of what others think of us. It leads many Koreans to put social expectations or collective interest before individuality or individual freedom. When I asked many Koreans why they would wear a mask or follow the government's guidance, many actually told me that they are afraid of being blamed otherwise. They would get this look from others on the streets if they go mask-free. Asked what they are most afraid of in case of they're infected with COVID-19, the majority of them said they are most afraid of being blamed by those around them when they get infected, according to a survey on 1,000 people by Korea Research. So this brings me to the end of the presentation and some questions I have for you and panelists and audience. What do you think were the most effective tools so far in what many hail as South Korea's successful response to coronavirus? We talked about this 3T strategy and in culture, social aspects. I'm sure by discussing this, there are some lessons other countries could learn from Korea, and then they could foster cooperation on an intergovernmental level. And the second question would be, is South Korea's response to the pandemic stemming from collective culture and Confucianism? And I actually found that many Western media outlets are portraying this as something negative. Like we are sacrificing too much of individual freedom for the sake of collective interest. But this kind of negative portrayal might be a result of Orientalism or something Western countries could overcome in the wake of pandemic if they could actually seek to more successfully bring the situation under control. I mean, I'm not saying Korea's way is right, but maybe it gives us a chance to explore like which way was working and which way could actually work in other countries too. So given different culture and social systems, I'm wondering whether this Korean's way could actually work in the US. Yes, that's it for my presentation, and I'm looking forward to our active discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Latisha. Thank you for the interesting explanation of how the Korean model worked, and very inspiring and stimulating questions you raised, and Hyunju also. So let me turn to Sang-hun. You're supposed to ask questions at the first round to the presenters, but you already got a lot of questions from the speakers. But anyway, it's your turn to ask questions and make comments on their presentations.
These were really excellent presentations, really good, as far as I can tell, really good summary of what's happening in South Korea and why people think that South Korean method of dealing with the coronavirus has been so successful. Really good presentations, I think. So I don't have a lot to add, but a couple of things that I can add to the presentations, I think. At the same time, dealing with some of the questions Latisha raised, I think. She already mentioned it, but I think one of the biggest reasons why South Korean method of dealing with the coronavirus so successful is that I think it has something to do with the very recent South Korean political development. Why we have a Moon Jae-in government in South Korea. As we all know, the previous government was impeached for many reasons, but one of the key reasons was that the government was blamed for mishandling the major national crisis, which was the sinking of a several ferry ship. And I think a new government coming in with a deep sense of responsibility about how the government should react to a major national crisis, and they also realized that how well they can deal with a major national crisis can really make or break the government reputation. And I think when this thing happened, as soon as the government realized that this is a major crisis, they really got to work, and they really tried to win the people's trust, which was the key of all this success in South Korea, as far as I can tell. And basically, we had a very responsive government because of what has been happening in South Korean domestic politics. I think that was one of the reasons we can add to the discussions about why South Korean method has been so successful. And another thing that I can add is that who were these people giving these daily briefings twice a day? And these people were not politically, these people were not agenda-driven political figures. They were public health experts. And, I mean, they could explain things in easy, everyday language that people could understand. And I think they didn't really exaggerate or distort what's happening in South Korea, and they didn't put any positive face on nothing. I mean, they didn't try to exaggerate, underestimate, or overestimate what's happening. And I think this very transparent and live streamed briefings, daily briefings, really helped people give their trust behind the South Korean government work. I think that was very important. When a time of crisis, sometimes you need experts rather than political figures to speak to the public. I think that was another factor that we can mention. And yeah, questions. I mean, we can discuss I happen to have the same questions that Latisha had. But another question we can raise here is the different ways people in South Korea and people, for example, in countries like the US, is approaching the issue of privacy. And I was very curious why the privacy issue has not become a major question in South Korean society. I mean, as one of the presenters mentioned, the people here didn't seem to be mind at all giving up their personal data, which is not exactly the case as far as I can tell in the US. And I think it would be very interesting to discuss this issue when you were talking about how the two allies can cooperate or learn from each other, because that seems to be one of the big differences between the two countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Sang-hoon. To make the best use of our limited amount of time, let me ask Anthony to provide your comments and also questions for the panelists, and we're going to give some time for the presenters to reply. And I think a lot of people will easily and quickly recognize your voice, Anthony.
So nice to join you all. Thank you very much for having me on. It's already a fascinating discussion and excellent presentations. I've been thinking constantly about this question of what the two countries can learn from each other and help each other with. It's become a huge part of my life. I'm answering questions about this every day from friends, from family. And in my job, I've been just very busy fielding the same sort of request, which is, what does a prepared country look like? What does a good response look like? What are the keys to it? How can we do this? And so I've been spending a lot of time on this. And my initial feeling is just that the 3 T's, I see a lot of these things happening in the US as well. They have had a lot of problems for a number of reasons, and these are all things that South Korea dealt with very early on, including after the MERS outbreak in 2015. It takes a system from collecting samples to having enough labs to process, to getting out information, and a bottleneck, and any of these will slow the whole system down, and that's what we've been seeing in the US. Now, testing is a much more, tracing is a much more complicated thing. Sang-hoon just, addressed this question of why are people not so concerned about privacy here? Well, I think a lot of it is trust. Not only do they, first of all, there have not been a lot of cases of leaks of people's identities. Also, we should note that the system that's been set up for contact tracing does have safeguards, and the government has emphasized this a lot. The law on personal information says that information should only be stored as long as it's useful, and people should only give up these freedoms in an emergency. And when the emergency is over, then the information is discarded. And the government has also been very good about warning people not to stigmatize patients. I've paid a considerable amount of attention to these two issues. And this week, I just reported on the fact we've been trying to get information from the government about what happened to the information from the MERS outbreak, because they say once the information has served its purpose, then it must be discarded. In fact, the government just told us that they have not discarded that information. They say, well, there may be complications. So they consider that information that they can store indefinitely, permanently, if need be. So I think this is a matter that affects the applicability of the tracing system to other countries, whether South Korea can become a global standard. This is an issue, and I believe the principle at stake here is very important. These powers to collect information are for a specific purpose, as an emergency, and it's very hard to argue that the MERS emergency is still happening. It's over. So, this is a question I have. I'll just say also that, I'm from Boston. I'm not going back to Boston this year, that's for sure. And Boston has a population of about 6.8 million and a COVID caseload of 108,000 compared to Korea. If you do the math, it's truly staggering. This week, what's caught my attention in the US is that President Trump has said, we're going to stop funding test centers, COVID test centers. There was an outburst at a public hearing in Palm Beach, Florida about the mandating of masks. And this was shocking. And I feel that, if the US is going to flatten the curve, they have some serious issues to deal with. I'm not saying that, these cases are representative of the mainstream or all of the country, but to me, they're a great case for worry. The other thing is that, it's been very interesting to see the relationship between the central government and the local governments. The US has a federal system. In a federal government system, we expect the federal government to step in when there is emergency and do something. But we have seen in a lot of cases, states being told by the federal government, you're on your own when it comes to, for example, medical equipment and stuff like that. And in South Korea, we have seen, the whole country respond and the central government surge supplies and doctors to Daegu at the heart of the crisis. Admittedly, there were people still left waiting for hospital beds, but a lot of people would say that's how a government should respond. I'll just bring up one other issue to come back to the issue of trust. Latisha mentioned that it's because of that trust that people are willing to give up data, that people are willing to cooperate. But, my question is, which came first, the trust or the performance? The polls that I have seen suggest that it is precisely because of the government's handling of the epidemic and the contrast with Western countries, such as in the US and Europe, that support for the presidential office and particularly for the KCDC shot up. So it's very hard for me to tell whether the trust was there to begin with or whether it was a result of the handling of the pandemic. I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, so thank you so much. Let's move on.
Thank you, Anthony and Sang-hoon, for your excellent questions and comments. Hyunju and Latisha, did you have anything to reply?
As Sang-hoon pointed out, the Seoul ferry disaster that happened in the previous government has been a collective trauma for all of us, and the government learned that we should respond faster to a crisis. And as Anthony said, we also learned a lot of lessons from the MERS outbreak in 2015. And I agree that it definitely gave us lessons to deal with this crisis with more knowledge and more wisely. And also, I also think that one of the reasons that South Koreans follow the quarantine guidelines better than people in other countries is that the government made it clear for its citizens why quarantine rules are needed and why we have to wear masks every time we go out. So I think that's why South Koreans understood the government's point, and they didn't really, there has been not much backlash about government collecting its extensive load of personal data and analyzing people's data with credit card transactions without even warrants or without their permission. And I think the government also did its part in persuading its citizens. And also about Anthony's point that even the local governments responded well to the crisis, I agree to your points that the Daegu and Daejeon has been specially designated, became the specially designated area during the crisis, and they even took stronger measures compared to the Seoul and other metropolitan areas. So I think I agree that even the local governments responded very well to the crisis, I think. And let's move on to Latisha.
Yes, I've been thinking about this a lot as well, but I really want to open the floor to just what you actually perceive this, what you think about this. But I feel like our priority is on public health rather than privacy. can you hear me? Yes, yes. It's like I was surprised to see Koreans who just voluntarily go testing stations and seek testing, especially when Itaewon outbreak happened in early May. There was a lot of stigma like attached to this, associated to this Itaewon outbreak in particular. It began with sexual minorities, like bars for sexual minorities, and it moved on to other clusters, other kinds of groups stigmatized, and it even at some point we got to the point where we had to seriously look at the generational gap, because many people who are in Taiwan, they will be in their 20s and 30s and going clubbing and going to bars, don't really care about the possible consequences, because the coronavirus is easy on those young people. So they, like many elderly people say, oh, these young people don't care about the coronavirus, and they go to community, they infect other people like in vulnerable groups. So anyway, it actually laid bare a lot of like aspects of Korean society, but I was surprised to see Koreans support, successfully cooperate and then just voluntarily go to testing stations to seek testing. What was interesting was that many of the English teachers, like native English teachers based in Korea, they were very upset. They were singled out for testing, COVID-19 testing. Like Itaewon in Korea is very much associated with expat community traditionally. There are many South Koreans hanging out in the neighborhood, but it has been traditionally the expat community that has been really hanging around in Itaewon, and Koreans wouldn't care just being asked for to be tested for the coronavirus, but then native English teachers were mostly from English-speaking countries and the US. They'll be very upset about being singled out for testing. I think it really shows like huge difference in the perception, their perception of the government's role during the pandemic and how much they are willing to cooperate to overcome this kind of like pandemic situation. Also on the point of the central government and the municipal government, I think one of the great things we did was that there was really a high level of consistency. So the central government and municipal governments in general, all the guidance like about them wearing a mask, easing of social distancing campaign, or return to normal daily lives, it was very consistent. So the public, the members of the public were not very confused from like different sources of information, whether to wear a mask or no, whether to go back to like normal life or no, keeping distance. So if we have time, I'd like to further discuss like whether the particular political system South Korea has will have been helpful actually in controlling the pandemic.
Thank you, Latisha and Hyunju. Before we move on to our second round of discussion, I'd like to remind our audience that you can type in your questions in the Q&A box now, not in the chat box, but a Q&A box. We're going to look into the Q&A box only. So please keep that in mind. So let's move on to our second round of discussion. Since all of our panelists covered the diplomatic and the national security issues also, I think we can expand our discussion into that context. And Anthony and Sang-Hoon, you may want to throw any questions you wanted to discuss. Anthony, did you want to go first?
Well, I'll just highlight a couple of things I'll be looking at, and I'm sure everybody is thinking about. One is, South Korea's success in tackling the epidemic has thrown open the question of how Seoul can leverage this to expand its role as a middle power, to provide leadership. It also raises the question of how Seoul is going to deal with the other outcome or fallout from this, which is the increased tensions between the US and China. So both of those are huge areas of concern that are sort of the international angle to this. So I would love to hear. I would love to hear everyone's opinions on this. I was startled by the range of opinions. For example, on the U.S.-China issue, in the past weeks, I have heard, without naming names, people argue that South Korea does not need to choose between the U.S. and China. On the other hand, other people have said South Korea has already made its choice. There's only one choice it can make, and the sooner it comes out in the open on it, the sooner it takes its seat at the table and gets to make the rules rather than following them. So I'm just curious what my distinguished colleagues are hearing and thinking on these subjects. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Anthony about the growing importance of this question of rising potential tension between U.S. and China. The coronavirus really highlighted what many South Koreans are considering the looming tension or even crisis between China and the U.S. And the South Koreans traditionally have always felt themselves sandwiched between Washington and Beijing. And this is a question that South Korea has been trying to avoid answering. Whenever they ask, people ask this question, the official public answer is that strategic ambiguity. And if the coronavirus really result in the rising tension between China and the U.S. and causes South Korea to choose between the two superpowers, it could be a major area of a diplomatic tension between Washington and Seoul. And I think it's really important for policymakers both in Seoul and Washington to anticipate this potential problem between in the alliance, and this is one of the major issues that the allies will have to deal with. And another point on diplomatic aspects of the coronavirus is that South Korea has been congratulating itself for its success for very often, and we see very often very common very frequent news releases from the government about how other countries are looking at the South Korean handling of coronavirus favorably. And but the question that comes to my mind is that, okay, what South Korea has really been doing to help other countries? As Anthony said, South Korea is trying to position itself as an influential middle power, and it may be a good time for South Korea to prove itself to be a true middle power by actually doing something, going beyond telling its people repeatedly that South Korea is doing very well, and the world is looking upon South Korea as a good example. Maybe it's time for South Korea to do something, in the concrete ways. They call it KQuarantine. It's a great slogan, but yeah, but what's really happening? Except sending some face masks and test kits to some countries, is there some more systematic way for South Korean, doing something positive around the world, especially helping other underdeveloped countries? People, I guess a lot of people are expecting South Korea to do that, but we haven't really seen a clear picture of how South Korea is going to do that, whether South Korea is actually is going to do that.
Okay, thank you, Anthony and Sang-Hun. Why don't we have Latisha go first this time, if you have any response to Anthony and Sang-Hun's comments.
Yeah. I think actually the post-pandemic era, like Korea's standing will be very different. And I can see a lot of hope and expectation, but I agree with Sang-Hun. I don't actually see what concrete things we are doing to help these countries and maybe raise our soft power on the international stage. So that I think we need to take a look at and devise a coordinated approach to actually place ourselves in the as an international middle power on the global forum. But as a correspondent who has been covering social issues, I think it's just like the government has been very much focusing on responding to the pandemic so far. So after this, I mean, I'm sure we will have to move on to this, how we can actually just position ourselves as an influential middle power. But I just guess we just had so much on plate in Korea, within the Korean society, and so many social issues that have been laid bare by the pandemic, and that's just my observation.
Thank you. And Hyunju, do you have any comments?
Yeah, as Anthony pointed out, there is a tension between two superpowers, China and the US. And what we have to focus on is that there is a blame game going on between the two, like they are blaming each other for the origin of the coronavirus. And they are trying to shift their blame for their slow response. And the US, like I remember that the Pompeo once said that they found enormous evidence that showed that the new coronavirus actually originated in a lab in Wuhan, in China. And the China is constantly denying the claim, and China is saying that they responded well with decisive action, like the locking up the entire region and creating a new hospital in a few days. So there is a blame game going on between the two. And China is also sending medical supplies to other countries, which is a move to take the place of the US as a global supporter in time of crisis. And in this time, I think I agree that the Korea is sandwiched between the two. And I don't think that that does necessarily mean that we have to choose between the two. Like we can diplomatically, the policymakers can diplomatically make a wise choice between the two. And also there are a lot of ongoing issues between US and Korea, like defense cost sharing issue, and also there is an issue about North Korea. So I think the US-RK alliance should be maintained despite this crisis. And so I think that balancing between the two would be really important. And about what Sang-hoon pointed out, South Korea has not done, people might say that South Korea has not done much in the global society to brag themselves as a K-quarantine model country. But I have read this article, and I actually wrote an art story about this today. It's a fairly recent news, but the South Korean government built a medical facility in Madagascar, the African country, and we are sending our staff there, and we try to share our know-how and disease control knowledge with them. So I think it can be a really small move for becoming a model country for disease prevention in this kind of global health crisis. And yes, I'll wrap up here.
Thank you. Before we move on to Q&A, I can see one question somebody typed in, but let me wait for a couple of more questions. And let me just briefly follow up on what Sang-hoon and Anthony said regarding the U.S. position. I think as journalists, working for the U.S. media outlets, I think you have a better position to have a better idea of what's been discussed in Washington or New York about the U.S. thinking, how to take advantage of this new coronavirus situation in the context of U.S.-China strategic competition. What's your understanding of U.S. planning or objectives? I understand President Trump invited, President Moon Jae-in to upcoming G7 meeting. But beyond that, do you have any other ideas that you heard or you discussed with your colleagues? If you can share with the audience.
Let me just share a couple of personal thoughts on that. First of all, I think it's, one could say that it's difficult for South Korea to step up the plate and really show leadership, but I think there's reason to say that at least there's huge potential here. It's precisely because the US and China are mired in this blame game and not really showing leadership at all, that opens the field for South Korea to step in and do things like, at the very least, organize some sort of regional response. There is, there are exchanges going on among South Korea, Japan, and China on public health. And I've also been thinking a lot about the G7 issue. A lot of media reported at the time that it puts South Korea and Japan in a very tough position of having to repeat the Trump administration's talking points of blaming China for the virus when they're trying to, stabilize their relationships, improve their economies, and all that sort of thing. My feeling, though, is that the G7 is a diverse enough group with countries like Italy and others that are not so one-sided about this and value their relations with China. And so if I were President Moon, I'd say, I'm going to take advantages of this to, promote South Korea's position and achievements. And I'm going to bet that the US is not going to be able to cobble together a solid bloc, a solid anti-China bloc on this. So if I were President Moon, that's why I would say I'm going and I'm going to get something out of it to bring home.
Thank you, Anthony. Simon, do you have any comments to make?
If there is one lesson we can learn from coronavirus is that this thing we cannot fight alone. I mean, the whole country, the global society should work together to fight the coronavirus. If we see Hollywood movies, when there is an alien attack, we see United States, Soviet Union, and UK and all countries around the world working together to fight this attack from aliens. I think pandemic like coronavirus is the closest thing humankind has to an alien attack, I think, in terms of how important it is to work together, join hands together. But what's happening between the two biggest powers in the world is not exactly what you have been seeing in Hollywood movies. Movies are movies, but so that's why I think it's important for some country, for example, country like South Korea, showing a good example, doing the kind of thing Hyunju just mentioned, in opening a hospital in other countries, helping each other in times of difficulty, showing good example. This can set a really important example, and it can really improve the South Korean image and help people realize, what matters in a time of a crisis like this.
Thank you. I see a couple of questions in the Q&A box, and let me deliver the first question. It's from James Park. North Korean government say they don't have COVID-19. China and Russia is helping North Korea, but how is South Korean government helping North Korea on COVID-19?
Well, we know as a fact that the South Korean government has officially offered to help North Korea to help North Korea fight COVID-19. We don't have all the details yet, but the government, President Moon Jae-in himself has made the offer. But as far as we can tell, North Korea has not accepted it in public yet. Maybe there is some talk going on behind the scene, but yeah, as far as we can tell, nothing has been going on between the two Koreas. All we have seen recently is that rising tension between the two Koreas, and there's growing voice among South Koreans that the South Korea should use the pandemic as an opportunity to probe how the two countries can work together and improve ties. But yeah, I mean, yeah, all we have seen is a stalemate so far.
Yes, unfortunately, that seems clear for the time being, but hopefully there's some progress on that front in the future. Let me move on to the next question by Wanmo Kang. Can you explain about the Korean government's protective measures, if any, and other restraints in using personal privacy information for public safety and welfare? I think our Korean journalist, Hyunju or Latisha, might be in a better position to respond. Hyunju, did you want to go first? Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, there is definitely a need to restrain using or overusing or misusing the personal information they collected for the coronavirus prevention. And as Anthony mentioned before, like we should discard the sensitive information after we have successfully dealt with the crisis. But the health authorities, I think, say that the information, the personal information they collected from the previous crisis can they can make use of those information in the later for the future prevention measures. So I'm not pretty sure they would discard the personal information instantly, and I also believe that the sensitive information like residence and the name of the infected and those personal details should be used for short-term fixes only for this coronavirus incident. And we should not keep using widespread data sharing and monitoring and surveillance for other health problems. And currently there would be some restraints inside the Korean government, and they would not overuse the information, and we trust the government, but we have not been informed of the clear line between just what kind of information they can collect and what kind of information they cannot get in contact with. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I'll look into it. Yeah.
I think South Korea need to install some kind of oversight on this matter. I mean, people have been trusting the government so far, but things always can go wrong. And when this kind of thing goes wrong, it could be, you know, it could be a political crisis at a bad moment. You know, the government has to deal with this crumbling trust issue at the same time while dealing with the coronavirus. So maybe there is such an oversight system going on already that I didn't know about. Yeah.
Thank you. Latisha, do you have anything to comment?
Yes, I really understand the concerns because as you can see, for example, during this Itaewon outbreak, it took just 1 day for Seoul Mayor Park Won-sun to get what he wanted, what he needed. All the people who've been to this area of Itaewon and all the people who've been to Itaewon, they got all these text messages that you should go actually seek the testing. It was possible because he had an access to this personal data in cooperation with these mobile carriers like SK Telecom and KT. So anyone who had been connected to 4G and 5G, their information was automatically transferred to the government. We are having this discussion. We are also worried about this, but so far, like Chair pointed out, we have had the trust in the government, and our priority was on public health. So we voluntarily gave out our information for the sake of protecting ourselves and protecting society. But we are slowly just moving on to discuss like what kind of oversight we need actually, because people started to be aware that we should be more discreet with our information, especially during this pandemic after we observed like all our detailed movement was just revealed to the public, and some people even got caught having affairs and going to some the secret places, and that really freaked many Koreans out, and we started to just wake up to it just now.
Okay, thank you. I think all of our panelists are journalists. I think you're directly or indirectly connected to the perception issues, perception of the people of what's going on. And you know, in particular, the US-South Korea relations in the coronavirus era, again, perception matters, I think. I was wondering, Sang-won and Anthony will be able to discuss the American people's perception of Korea. Is there any change? Do you think if there's a change, do you think there's going to be any impact on how the two governments would move on? Any thoughts on that? And probably Hyunju and Latisha, can discuss the South Korean people's perception of the U.S. In this difficult times, and how that changes the underlying factors of the two countries' relationship. So Anthony, you're unmuted already. So did you want to go first?
Well, as I said, I think it's very clear that through media reports, a lot of people have placed South Korea in the category of countries that have dealt successfully. They, of course, include places like Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, to a lesser extent, Japan, and all of that. And I hope that, all the work I've been doing, trying to explain what South Korea has done right and what it's still working on, will lead to a better understanding. Will at least make people aware of what's happening in South Korea. But what I'm really hoping for, to be honest, is that the U.S. has had such a big impact on South Korea over the past 7 decades. I'm hoping that South Korea will sort of reinfect the U.S., to use a bad metaphor, reinfect the U.S. with some of the concepts of democracy and civic consciousness and awareness of public goods. I mean, I just think a huge discussion is needed. When I look at what's going on in the U.S., I feel we need a huge discussion about what are governments for, what should the state's relation to the people be. It's just, you all know that there's a lot of talk about aspects of a failed state in the U.S. And so I think there just needs to be a massive reconsideration, and I hope that South Korea can play a role in it.
Well, although I write to the New York Times, I spend most of my time in Seoul, so I can't really judge the Americans' perception of South Korea, but I think I agree with Anthony. I mean, from all these news reports coming out of South Korea, I guess the image of South Korea among Americans has improved a lot because of its successful handling of COVID-19. But having said that, we also have a lot of trouble between in the potential troubles unresolved in the alliance, like still going on defense cost sharing talk, and it has been dragging on and on beyond deadline, I think. And also there could be a potential crisis, potential conflict between Washington and Seoul about how to resolve North Korean nuclear issue. There is a gap between Washington and Seoul in the approach, as was, I guess, made dramatically clear by the new book by John Bolton, and also the how to deal with China, rising China is also a big problem between the Washington and Seoul. I mean, potential big problem between Washington and Seoul. I don't know how these issues can be affected by South Korea's successful handling of COVID-19. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, the image has improved certainly among Americans, I think.
Before I turn it over to Hyunju and Latisha, I have one quick question from the attendees, one of the attendees, anonymous attendee, where the question related to the things Hyunju and Latisha are going to deal with. The question is, Korean people's traditional favorable view of the U.S. could be changed after seeing the current U.S. government and leadership's handling of pandemic, Black Lives Matter movement, lack of proper healthcare program, among others. How much do you think this will affect the policy of the Korean government toward the US and China in the future? So, yes, Latisha?
Yeah, very unfortunately, the image of the US has not improved in Korea among South Koreans. What we see from news, based on facts, I guess, is that it's very expensive to be tested in the US and then just be treated for the coronavirus, and distribution of public resources not even, and like there are inconsistencies in the government response to the pandemic. Basically, I think South Koreans largely perceive the US response to the pandemic as some kind of like a failure. So that, and also like many of South Korean students studying in the US, they actually rushed back home because they were very afraid of getting racism and then getting racist attacks and not getting proper medical treatment in the US in case they get infected. So that explains a lot about how South Koreans perceive about the US right now. Despite that though, how South Korea needs the US very much on a diplomatic level as an ally is not going to change that much. And we have the presidential election coming up in the US, and we don't know whether there will be any change in the leadership, but it is very true, it has been traditionally true, we are very interdependent and we rely on a lot on the US. So despite how the US government has responded to the pandemic, I think the cooperation between the two countries will just advance and go on, and it has been like that despite all the social aspects. We sometimes have disagreements on and agreements on. Yes, that's it for me.
And I would like to add a few points to that. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement happening in the US actually made us look back on ourselves. In January and February, Asians faced discrimination and racism everywhere around the world. And we did the same to the Chinese people. We saw them as a origin of this coronavirus. And South Korean websites were really flooded with the comments from people saying that we should block or expel Chinese people because they are the origin of the virus. So we did racism, and we have been the victim of the racism. So I think the Black Lives Matter movement is not only the problem of the US specifically, but it also made us to look back on ourselves and how we did during this coronavirus pandemic. And we made racist remarks about Chinese eating habits and hygiene. And I think this problem not only applies to the US, but we all have to think about it. And also, and about the relationship between the United States and Korea, it's true that the US is still seeing the rapid increase in the new infections, but South Koreans think that the US has all these cutting edge technologies and they have accumulated knowledge about the disease control. So I think they would eventually take the lead in in developing vaccines. Actually, the American medical company Moderna is ahead of all the other companies in the vaccine development. So I think the US and South Korea can still maintain its ties as important partners with each other. And also the South Korea has always been on the receiving end of the US aid, but now we can give US something like the test kits and our know-how in disease control. So I think the relationship between the two would develop in a positive way. Yeah, thanks to this and make this crisis as a chance to improve our ties. Yeah.
Thank you. Hopefully we can get a faster development of vaccine thanks to the upgraded relationship between the two countries. We have just a couple of minutes left. If there's anything you want to make as a final comments, this is the last chance. Do you have any comments to make? Hyunju, Latisha, Sangwon, Anthony? No. Probably we discussed too much, and people in Seoul, it's still already too late. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us and staying late up at night. So I think we need to conclude today's our webinar. Again, I'd like to thank all the panelists for taking their time and our team, both at GWIX and JPI, for putting this together. And thank you all for joining us, our attendees. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.